Chapter 7. Sadie's Suspicions. Nancy drew herself erect and leveled her calm blue eyes upon the irate woman. For a moment, Emma Semmet faltered. Then, as if twice angered at allowing herself to be checked by a young girl, the woman burst forth again into a bitter tirade. "Here we have worked and slaved to make a home for you, an orphan asylum charity child, and this is our reward," Mrs. Semmet screamed. Sadie cowered against Nancy, and her thin little body quivered in every fiber. "If you act like a 2-year-old, you will have to be treated like one," Mrs. Semmet cried, and with that remark she hit Sadie on the shoulder with the back of the hairbrush. The girl gave a cry of pain as the brush descended a second time, bruising her knuckles. Nancy's face turned white with mingled disgust, anger, and pity for the orphan lass. "Stop striking this girl," she said in level, cold tones, at the same time pulling Sadie out of her foster mother's reach and thrusting her behind herself. "Who are you to come interfering with a mother correcting a wayward child? I'd like to know," Emma Semmet fumed. "I never saw the likes of your nerve. You, a mere chit yourself." "You certainly are proving yourself unfit to take a mother's place," Nancy answered hotly. "Oh, you vixen!" Choking with rage, Mrs. Semmet lashed out at Nancy, striking her on the chest with the brush. She raised her hand again to repeat the blow, but Nancy deftly caught the woman's wrist and wrenched the hairbrush from her grasp. "I could have you arrested for that," the girl said, her blue eyes now blazing with a steely glint. "Yes, maybe you think so. Who do you think you are?" Mrs. Semmet sneered, her courage shaken by Nancy's brave stand. She made no attempt to regain her brush, evidently fearing that Nancy might pay her back in her own coin. "Who I am makes no difference at all, so far as your attacking me goes," Nancy replied. "We'll see about that," Mrs. Semmet snarled. "I guess this is my house and I can run it as I see fit, and that includes running out intruders." "This is not your house in the first place, and I am not an intruder in the second place," Nancy shot back. Mrs. Semmet's jaw dropped. What do you mean?" she stammered. "This house belongs to Asa Sidney, and I am here at his invitation," Nancy said. "Who are you, then, if you know everything?" the woman demanded with respect in her voice. "My name is Nancy Drew. Carson Drew is my father. Perhaps you have heard of him? He is upstairs with Mr. Sidney now," Nancy explained, a little thrill of triumph in her voice as she saw Mrs. Semmet's arrogance collapse. "Carson Drew, the lawyer?" Mrs. Semmet asked weakly, feeling for the doorframe to brace herself. "Yes, Carson Drew," Nancy repeated. "The same Carson Drew who smashed the crooked political ring in the county last winter. The same Carson Drew who exposed the fake electric power stock scheme before that." I know all about him," Mrs. Semmet muttered. "His name is in the papers all the time, and I've seen yours there too. I didn't know who you were. I'm sorry I hit you. It's my nasty black temper that gets the best of me. I'm sorry." "It seems to make a difference to you whom you hit," Nancy could not help observing. "You won't tell your father, will you?" Mrs. Semmet begged. "I'll do anything to make amends." "I'll make a bargain with you," Nancy said. "I will tell Mr. Drew nothing, if you will promise not to tell Mr. Semmet anything." "That's agreed," the woman eagerly cried. "Very well," Nancy said, turning away and drawing Sadie with her. "If Sadie is subjected to any more punishment, then I shall complain to my father and have him prosecute you." Nancy walked from the room with the speechless Sadie in tow. The girl had never before seen Mrs. Semmet bested in an argument. Even her husband was afraid of her sharp tongue. Nancy took on ever greater proportions in Sadie's estimation. Mrs. Semmet stared at Nancy's retreating form with angry eyes. "You had the upper hand this time, young lady," she muttered. "We'll see what happens next time we match wits." However, she blanched and almost dropped her hairbrush when Nancy turned on her heel. For a moment, Mrs. Semmet thought Nancy had the power to read one's thoughts, but the young woman merely told the housekeeper that she felt hungry after an early breakfast and would have Sadie serve her with cocoa and crackers. Yes, that is perfectly all right," Mrs. Semmet said with exaggerated cordiality. Thus it was that Nancy planned to have further opportunity to consult with Sadie, free from the danger of eavesdroppers. She seated herself in the center of one of the two dining rooms and motioned Sadie to sit opposite her when the girl returned with a pot of chocolate and a plateful of sweet crackers. "I promised to tell you about Mr. Sidney and his quarrelsome relatives," Nancy said. She told the absorbed Sadie the story Hannah had related the night before, but in less detail. Evidently, Mr. Sidney is wealthy, Nancy concluded. He made a considerable fortune when he was younger, and he has not spent much, living in seclusion as he does. So now the relatives, none of whom took part in the original quarrel, are trying to get that fortune. At least, that is the way I figure it out. "And one side or the other must have succeeded, because Mr. Sidney is making his new will today," Sadie exclaimed. "On the other hand, he may be so disgusted with them all that he is leaving his fortune to charity," Nancy smiled. "It would serve the greedy relatives right," Sadie replied. "That is—" A troubled look crossed her face, and Sadie lapsed into silence, staring into space. "What is troubling you?" Nancy asked, leaning forward and placing her hand on the saddened girl's shoulder. "I don't know my own mind," Sadie answered with a catch in her voice. "Oh, Nancy, I wish I were as smart as you are. Everything seems so clear to you, while to me it is all a muddle." "Nonsense," scoffed Nancy. "Come, maybe I can help you." "I am an orphan. I guess you know that from the way Mother Semmet talked," Sadie said rather bitterly. "I know nothing about my parents. I was left in a church when I was taught, and the Semmets took me from an orphan asylum when I was 6 years old. I have worked hard for them. When I went to school, I came home to find dozens and dozens of dishes piled up for me to wash. I think I owe the Semmets nothing. I have paid my way. Only Mr. Sidney was nice to me. The Semmets were always sweet and kind to me, too, when he was around. I am sure I owe him more loyalty than I do my foster parents. And yet— What is the matter, Sadie? Do you suspect that the Semmets are not being honest with Mr. Sidney?" Nancy asked gently. "Why, how did you guess?" Sadie cried. "Do you also suspect them?" "Yes, I do, and with good reason," Nancy said. "However, it is only a suspicion." Her mind flashed to the box she had seen Semmet burying. Wisely, she resolved that, much as she pitied Sadie, it would be better to hold her own counsel for the time being. Sadie, though, warmed by the new friendship, leaned toward Nancy, her eyes round with excitement. "I am pretty sure that Father Semmet is robbing Mr. Sidney, while the old man's mind is taken up with his quarrelsome relatives," she whispered. "I have seen him sneaking around mysteriously, and sometimes he suddenly seems to have a lot of money, much more than this unknown wayside inn ever earns. Of course, That is very interesting," Nancy said loudly. Once we had some baby robins in a vine outside a bedroom window, too. Do you have many wrens?" Sadie's mouth opened wide in astonishment. Had Nancy suddenly lost her mind? End of chapter 8.